Welcome to another video. Today it is the 1st of January 2023, so happy New Year's to everybody. And today we're going to be going over specifically the situation on the Luhansk front over the past week or two, just to give a good analysis because I haven't been talking about it lately. Most of the media attention has been on Bakhmut, but at the same time there's been a lot of activity around Svatove. I would say it's the second most active front behind Bakhmut, so I do want to give some updates to the situation over there. So let's get into this. I'm going to work my way up, or in this case down, by starting out working from the north in the area of Kuzhamivka all the way to Bilohorivka. I'm not really going to talk about the northernmost front around Liman Pershi to Persotravneve and Orlianske because all the information here is unconfirmed. There's not really any good information about Ukrainian gains. I have seen some allegations that they were able to break through around Persotravnike and Orlianske and around Tokarivka, but there's no proof and no really reputable media outlets or sources have reported on this. And so for now, I'm just going to keep the map as is for the northernmost parts, where Russia does have a pretty solid defense line, so it would be very unlikely that they withdraw voluntarily. But anyway, let's move on to where we do actually have a lot of interesting information. So starting out with Novoselivske. Novoselivske, it was originally under Ukrainian control when they conducted their original Svatove campaign, which has not reached Svatove yet. But in an effort to gain more favorable positions and to have sort of a buffer around Kuzhamivka to prevent the P66 highway, which connects from Kupiansk to Svatove, from falling, the Russians launched a limited counterattack around here with their units, specifically from the 127th Motor Rifle Division. And this unit stormed the town of Novoselivske and was able to take it over. I reported on this at the time. And since then, the situation has really been fluid with back and forth fighting, Ukrainians launching their own armored assaults back into the village. But it was sort of understood by most people that the Russians at least had a foothold in the eastern part of the town and that they might have also encroached onto some of these warehouses over here. So then we got this very interesting video from the Kraken Battalion, and I'm going to go on a tangent for a second and explain some of the history of the Kraken Battalion. The Kraken Battalion is one of Ukraine's most battle-hardened units. A lot of the members of the Kraken Battalion used to serve in the Azov Battalion, and then after a lot of destruction in Mariupol, some of them that survived moved on to the Kraken Battalion. So the Kraken Battalion, it has similar origins, and they were able to contain a lot of Russia's original offensives around Kharkiv, attacking the city of Kharkiv, and they took back a lot of the northern towns, really without much support from most of the AFU, because the AFU itself was fighting elsewhere, trying to contain the Russian advances. They were able to make some limited counterattacks in the northern Kharkiv Oblast. Then they were a big part of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which retook Balaklia. So Kraken were some of the first units to enter Balaklia. Let me show that to everybody, by the way. To enter the city of Balaklia over here. Then they helped in the spearhead towards the city of Kupiansk, and then they were also integral in taking over Izium. And since then, they've been fighting on the Luhansk front, steadily advancing towards Svatove. So you hear the name a lot, especially in the northern part of the Luhansk front, around cities like Nizhnya Jivanka or Svatove, of course. And so they have been recorded fighting in Novoselivske with the 92nd Mechanized Brigade. 92nd Mechanized Brigade is one of Ukraine's best units, very battle-hardened, so it has some good experience. I'm going to try to find them over here. This is the 92nd Mechanized Brigade stationed out of Kupiansk, but of course they have units that are fighting in northern Kharkiv. They have units that are fighting in the Luhansk front. So yeah, they're working in tandem. The Kraken Battalion is doing most of the on-the-ground work in terms of storming the houses, while the 92nd Brigade, they're providing more of artillery supports. And so you could see in this recent YouTube video released by Kraken the course of events in the Ukrainian counterattack at this town. And so I want to just run down what happened. I geolocated the video myself, but I'm sure that somebody else geolocated it before me. but I found the locations which confirmed that Russia had full control of the town because the Ukrainians were striking warehouses within Novoselivske, which are in the westernmost part of the town. So you can see that the 92nd Brigade and the Kraken Battalion, their artillery units, they attacked Russian BTR-80s, which is an armored personnel carrier. Carries about 11 soldiers at a time. And so a BTR-80 was destroyed. There was also nearby a T-90 Russian tank, which was damaged, but later on the Russians were able to retrieve it. So it's still probably operable, although it did suffer some damage. Here you can see that the Kraken Battalion, using mortars, it was targeting the Russian warehouses. So it's not limited to just this one location. All these warehouses over here that you can see, they were targeted. They probably had troop concentrations. They might have had some ammunition or just other sort of supplies. So they were targeted. And it wasn't just warehouses. There were also some residential areas next to the warehouses that were targeted. Like over here, you can see the freaking mortars were hitting the warehouse. It also assumed that the 92nd Battalion or brigade was an integral part of the shelling of the Russian positions over here. It has its own artillery battalions, including self-propelled artillery battalions. And so they use 2S3 Akatsiya and 2S1 Gvozdika rocket and rocket artillery in their shelling. And so in terms of like rocket artillery, they'd probably be using like BM-21 Grads. And then they also have some artillery that's specifically targeted towards tanks. So that might have destroyed the T-90 or damaged it. That would be the T-12 100mm anti-tank guns. And so all these different equipments, they're being used by the 92nd Brigade probably to attack the Russian positions around here. They might be stationed around Pischane. There's some good artillery positions over there, sort of overlooking places like Novoselivske. Maybe around Brest-Litovsk, but that might be too close to the front line. But that's neither here nor there. The main point is that the Ukrainian artillery was effective at targeting the Russian troop concentrations and their reinforcements, like when they sent that BTR, and at preventing their tanks from playing a key role in the battle. And then the Kraken Battalion had sent in its own infantrymen in some of these armored personnel carriers. I'm not sure which one it is, but they were able to go in. They started out in some open fields. That's where they got dropped off. Let me try to visualize this. I think it was in the northern part, or maybe it was the western part. Either way, it was from one of these open fields. And then from there, they were able to gain a foothold in some of the residential areas. And then from there, they quickly pushed the Russians out. You can see in the drone footage that the Russians, they quickly withdrew once they saw the threat. And they established a new line around the Kuzhimivka rail line. And so the town is basically under Ukrainian control right now. And in the process, they took some prisoners of war. I saw in the video about a dozen of them that were captured. And all in all, this shows that the Ukrainians were successful in at least countering some of the Russian advances over here. Now, taking Kuzhimivka is going to be more difficult because Kuzhimivka, you can see it's a larger town, first of all. It's also more forested. There's some more forested areas for the Russians to use. There's some ponds. All in all, the geography is not as favorable, and the Russians have heavily fortified this area. They first of all fortified the rail line, and I'm sure they have some backup lines all around Kuzhimivka. So assaulting it head on is going to be very difficult, which is why we've seen the Ukrainians improvise and attack elsewhere. So in this entire area, which is centered around this sort of low elevation point, I don't know if there's a river over here or some valley, but it's stretching from the towns of Andriivka, Miaso, Harivka, and Stamkivka. This entire area has a lot of Ukrainian troops right now, and there are some important units that are involved in Ukraine's operations in this area. So that's including the 4th Tank Brigade, which is obviously giving the tank support, as I said before, Kraken and 92nd Brigade. And then you have the Omega unit, or the Omega detachment of the Ukrainian National Guard. You also have some volunteer battalions in this area, like the Khartia Battalion and the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade. And so all these units are stationed in this area. They were a part of the taking of the border towns between Kharkiv and Luhansk. And now, using their pretty strong positions in Stamkivka, they were able to advance deep into the original Russian lines and take over, at least in the northern part of Kolomichicha, and actually reach the P-66 highway and begin fighting around Pidkuichansk. And so this is a threat to the Russian grouping, first of all, to the south of this rail line over here in Krovovishivka, and more importantly to Kuzhimivka, because the southern flank is exposed. It's also a threat to the grouping in Zmivka, which is another town over here. And we've seen Ukrainian sources report that fighting has been recorded near the town of Zmivka, which could imply that the Ukrainians have been able to break through around the P-66 highway in this general area. Now, I will say the situation is fluid in that every day there could be back and forth over here, but it is, I would say, pretty undeniable that the Ukrainians have at least moved the front line at least a few, maybe 1 kilometer to the east compared to what it was before. But land itself isn't what matters over here. It's more so the geographic positions. So if they control the heights, that's more important. If they control key roads, then that's really what matters, or forest belts in this case. And so I want to open up the topographic map for a second. Here you can see Svatove. It's in very low elevation compared to the surrounding areas. I want to find the part on the front line that I was just talking about over here. So give me a second. So here's roughly the front line in the area that I was just talking about compared with the topographic map. You could see, first of all, that the entire Stelmakivka Valley, as I will call it, is in a low elevation area, and that the heights in between Stelmakivka Valley and the Russian line is really what's being fought over, because using these heights you could dominate, you could overlook the key positions of your enemy, use it for shelling, stuff like that. And so now Ukraine has been able to push over and take these red areas you can see by pushing onto the highway, the H26 or P66 highway. They are able to, first of all, overlook the rest of the town over here, and also to overlook this town over here to the south of the rail line. And then that could also prove to be very difficult for the grouping in Kuzhimivka, because they could also be overlooked. Not to mention the fact that Svatove itself could be overlooked from here. And Svatove is within the range of artillery at this point if Ukraine is able to obviously solidify their control in this area. So I'm going to get into that later. But all in all, you can see how the geography is looking in favor of the Ukrainians in this area, given the fact that they now control the heights, and that Russia has its positions in a lower elevation area around settlements, which are almost always in lower elevation. Same thing with roads. Those are also usually in lower elevation. Something similar is going on in Ryhorodka, where the Ukrainian 80th Air Assault Brigade is trying to attack the Russian positions over here. They've had very limited progress over the past few months. They've got bogged down in Serhivka. Even though they control the dominant heights in some of the forest belts over here, that's not been enough to break through the Russian line at Ryhorodka. The Russians are in defensive posture over here, and they've been able to hold the line. And so you can see that the fighting has just been relegated to Serhivka, which is still under Russian control, although some would say that it is a bit of a gray zone. Let me look at the topographic map for a second. Over here, you can see that Ryhorodka is in a very low elevation area, but that it is important. It's one of the towns it's one of the last towns before reaching the P66 road, and it's one of the last towns before reaching the main Svatove line and the chain of towns that are immediately to the north of south of it. And so Ryhorodka is very important to the Russian defensive line. You don't want it to fall, because it could lead to a major breakthrough for the Ukrainians, as they would be able to take over many of the surrounding regions and actually envelop some of Russia's other positions that might be sticking out in sort of a pincer maneuver. Because you can see that the Ukrainians, they were able to sort of create a bulge over here, which is in a gray zone, but if they can solidify control, then they do have a bulge over here. And then if Ryhorodka falls, they're able to create something similar to the south. And so that would leave the Russians exposed in these two towns over here, Gyarelny and Patalakivka. And so that might force them to withdraw towards positions that are much closer to Svatove and rely on a closer defensive line, again, making it much more difficult to supply Svatove, making it much more difficult to supply Kremina, making it much more possible to communicate between the two. So again, it's all about shaping the battlefield for basically making the conditions as bad as possible for the Russians. And so that's what we're seeing going on around Raihorodka. But as I said before, they're trying to hold their line over there, the Russians. They're also holding their line at Kovalivka. Kovalivka is, again, a very important town, because if Kovalivka falls, then Raihorodka can be enveloped, and then you have the same story. So, according to the Ukrainian general staff, they say that Russia shelled the town, and this is the first time that they've said this in a while, and so it is pretty interesting. It might just be back and forth, because Ukraine could obviously enter through some of the forest belts over here and do just like these hit-and-run attacks on the town, but again, for the most part, it does seem that it's under Russian control. I have no proof to the contrary besides statements. And so we're going to move further to the south and talk about some of the situation around Makivka, because the situation here is very interesting. As I've been saying for most of the video, the Ukrainians sort of have the initiative in this area, but it seems as if the situation is opposite in Makivka, where you have two Russian units over here, the 3rd Motor Rifle Division and the 76th Guards Aerosol Division. And there's also the 74th Brigade, or it might be a division. I am not sure. But either way, those 3 units, they're actively engaged in overrunning some of Ukraine's fortified positions in between Ploshchanka and Makivka. And Ploshchanka, a lot of sources are saying that it's a gray zone right now and that Ukraine is trying to take it over. But based upon the recent Russian advances over here, there sort of is a buffer zone between the town of Ploshchanka and the front line, because the Russian units over here, they were able to take it over using their artillery advantage and advance towards the road with Makivka. And this is how I originally had the map, but it seems as if the map was closer to this beforehand, and that now the Russians have been able to make these gains around the open ditches, around some of these open fields as well. But again, it's not in an effort to really make some sort of grand counterattack. It's just shaping the battlefield in a way which prevents a breakthrough at Ploshchanka, because a breakthrough at Ploshchanka would put the Russians in peril, because from there the Ukrainians would have nothing stopping them from reaching Krasnoyarchensk, and from there they would just be able to envelop the Russian groupings in Chervonopopivka, Pischane, Zytlivka. All of them would be in danger, and so Ploshchanka is very necessary to hold on to, which is why you have this emphasis on the town. Speaking of Chervonopopivka, the Ukrainian sources are saying that it is under their control. Again, this is not backed by any evidence. We have no proof of this. I would say that Chervonopopivka is under Russian control at the moment, and that Ukraine is trying to launch attacks onto it, but that they've been repelled up until now. You could look at some geolocated footage from the area. You have the 1st Special Purpose Brigade hitting Russian positions in this area. This is the unit. It is located around the Zharabets River Valley, I would say. And they're actively targeting Russian outposts, Russian military positions with vehicles, or whatever it may be. Whatever positions they could find exposed, they are attacking, obviously utilizing their drone capabilities. And that's really what we've been seeing, just a fluid situation, because I don't exactly know who's in control of each specific forest belt, so I have to leave these as a gray zone right now. But for the most part, Chervonopopivka is under Russian control. You can see that the fighting is more to the west based on geolocated footage that I have over here. The same goes for Ploshchanka. A lot of the geolocated footage I have is to the south of Ploshchanka, which again proves that the Russians are stationed over here. And this is how I base my map. It's all based on geolocations to make sure that it's accurate as possible. Now, in terms of Crimea itself is not threatened at the moment, because first the Ukrainians need to take over Chervonopopivka and Ploshchanka, as I said. They also could try to attack from the south using the forest, and we've seen them do that using their DRG units. And they do have some success at that. Like, for instance, the Ukrainians have been good with DRG around like Balaklia and around Kharkiv when they didn't have many of their conventional units. They use a lot of reconnaissance units just to hold the line and to probe the Russian lines before their own offensives. And so they're trying to do something similar here with their DRG units around Kremina, Dibrova, Krimki. But this does not mean that the city of Kremina itself is threatened. You have a lot of Russian fortifications in this area, especially in the western part of the town. There are a lot of Russian positions that were set up. Artillery bars 16, bars 13 stationed around here, and they've been replenished. You have the 144th guards, motor rifle division stationed in this area, and so they will not be giving up Kreminna without a fight, because it is an integral part of the cohesiveness between the entire Svatove line. So giving it up would be very dangerous, not just for Kreminna, but also for Rubizhny, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, this entire area that Russia took over during the summer. Now, before I end, I want to talk about the situation in Bilohorivka, which is not really connected to the Svatove Kreminna front. It is more of like the Donetsk front, I would say, but still it is in the Luhansk regional boundary, so I want to give an update over here. I did have the map as a pretty liberal towards Russia, but I made some adjustments to make it more accurate now. So the Wagner Group has been able to enter the northern parts of Bilohorivka, and by the way, it's not just the Wagner Group, it's also Bar 16, and so they were able to enter northern parts, and now they have a foothold over there trying to attack into the middle. They sort of have Bilohorivka in a sort of envelopment, but they don't have the capabilities to fully push the Ukrainians out. They're hitting pretty hard the Ukrainian filtration plant. It's called Zakhidna. That's the name of the water filtration plant, where Ukraine has some pretty fortified positions. They also have some fortified positions on this white mountain. And the Ukrainian unit that is defending against these attacks is the 27th Infantry Brigade. Before I end the video, I want to talk about the threat that Svatove has right now, because Svatove itself, it will not be taken over by the Ukrainians really anytime soon, despite everything that I said in this video. But what is important to note is that it's now dangerously close to Ukrainian shelling. Obviously, it can be hit by HIMARS or some longer range system, or like a mid-range artillery system, but now it's also going to be hit by short-range artillery systems, ones that can like shoot 8 to 20 kilometers away. So I want to mention some of the information regarding that. Using their new positions around the bulge over here that I previously talked about in the video, or using their positions around Kovalivka, which if they take over Kovalivka, that would be very dangerous, not just because of the like on the ground situation, but also because of the shelling situation. They could plausibly shell Svatove. Although the artillery would be stationed very close to the front line, they would be able to utilize the heights to attack Svatove, which is in a lower elevation. And because the gap in between these two circles and Svatove is only about 10 miles, converted into a metric system, that's about 16 kilometers, they would be able to destroy some of the Russian positions on the outskirts of Svatove, although it would not impact that much the center of Svatove. And so Russia could still potentially like work on defensive positions just to the west of the town and not be impacted as much. But anyway, in terms of Ukrainian equipment, they're mainly using 100 to 105 millimeter shells in their shelling, juxtaposed to 122 millimeter shells, which they have a shortage of. And so for the 100 to 105 millimeter shells, the artillery systems that use those are mainly the L-118 and the L-119 light guns. And so those are within the range of Svatove at the moment, although again, as I said, logistically it would be difficult to place them that close to the front lines. But that is all for today. So thank you all for watching.